Basketball history is filled with myths, stories repeated so often that fans stop questioning them. And when it comes to the 1990 Chicago Bulls, no myth has spread further than this: that their dynasty was built on an easy road. It's one of the most common refrains you'll hear in today's debates. Jordan never faced real competition. The league was watered down. The Bulls never beat a true super team. The words roll off the tongue as if they're facts. But look closer and you'll realize something fascinating. These so-called easy roads were lined with Hall of Famers, MVPs, and franchises on the rise. These weak opponents were the very teams knocking off other supposed super teams before running into Chicago. And these no-challenge years? They happen to include some of the most competitive playoff series and stacked rosters the NBA has ever seen. The truth is that the Bulls didn't just win, they won during an era filled with bruising defenses, loaded rosters, and relentless challengers. They beat dynasties in decline, contenders in their prime, and future dynasties on the rise. If anything, their dominance didn't expose weakness in the league, it exposed how far ahead they were. So let's pull back the curtain and let's examine the truth about the 1990s, the strength of the league at the time, and the obstacles Chicago had to overcome to build the greatest dynasty basketball has ever seen. The journey started in 1991. For years, the Bulls had been beaten down by the Detroit Pistons, the infamous Bad Boys who had eliminated Chicago 3 years in a row. They were the physical and psychological hurdle Jordan and Pippen couldn't clear. But in 1991, it all came together. Chicago swept Detroit in the Eastern Conference Finals, winning by an average of 11.5 points. Critics later tried to excuse Detroit's failure by saying they were too old. But that's a myth. Isaiah Thomas was 29, Joe Dumars was 27, Dennis Rodman was 29. Those were all prime years. Bill Laimbeer was 33, Mark Aguirre was 31. Not ancient by NBA standards. The Pistons weren't old, they were dethroned. Chicago's rise was so decisive that Detroit walked off the court without shaking hands, a final act of bitterness. From there, the Bulls went on to face the Los Angeles Lakers in the finals. This wasn't the Showtime Lakers of the mid-'80s, but it was still a finals team with Magic Johnson, James Worthy, and worthy veterans who had just beaten Portland in the Western Conference Finals. Magic was still Magic, averaging a double-double with 19 points and 12 assists that season. The Lakers even stole Game 1 in Chicago before the Bulls rattled off 4 straight wins. The dynasty had begun. In 1992, the Bulls repeated, and this time the competition was even tougher. They faced the Portland Trail Blazers, led by Clyde Drexler, who had just finished second in MVP voting behind Jordan. Drexler was a perennial All-NBA guard, a finals veteran from 1990, and Portland had won 57 games with a deep roster, including Terry Porter, Jerome Kersey, Buck Williams, and Clifford Robinson. This wasn't a weak team. This was a powerhouse that had been to the finals 2 years earlier. The series went 6 games, including the iconic shrug game from Jordan in Game 1, when he hit 6 threes in the first half and looked at the broadcast table in disbelief. The Bulls closed it out at home, cementing their back-to-back. The 1993 run may have been their toughest of the first three-peat. Chicago faced a gauntlet in the East: the Atlanta Hawks with Dominique Wilkins, the Cleveland Cavaliers with Mark Price and Brad Daugherty, and the New York Knicks, who had Patrick Ewing, Charles Oakley, and John Starks. The Knicks were the second seed, a 60-win team, and they pushed Chicago to 7 games in the Eastern Conference Finals. This was no cakewalk. Then, in the finals, the Bulls faced Charles Barkley's Phoenix Suns. Barkley had just won the MVP over Jordan, leading Phoenix to 62 wins, the best record in the league. Kevin Johnson, Dan Marley, and a strong supporting cast gave Phoenix a chance. The finals went 6 games, ending with John Paxton's legendary game-winning 3 in Game 6. That was the end of the first three-peat, and Jordan retired shortly after. When Jordan returned from baseball in 1995, the Bulls weren't invincible. They ran into Shaquille O'Neal and Penny Hardaway's Orlando Magic in the playoffs. Shaq was already the most dominant big man in the league, averaging 29 points and 11 rebounds. Penny was a 6'7" point guard with elite vision and scoring ability. Orlando had Horace Grant, Nick Anderson, and Dennis Scott. They won 57 games and knocked out Chicago in the second round. That loss showed that the East wasn't weak and that the Bulls would need to reload. And reload they did. In 1996, the Bulls added Dennis Rodman, and what followed was the greatest regular season in history at that time. 72 wins. But again, the playoffs were no easy road. They swept the Miami Heat in the first round, then faced the New York Knicks again. Still a rugged defensive team under Pat Riley. In the conference finals, they battled the Orlando Magic, now with Shaq and Penny still in their primes. Chicago demolished them in a 4-game sweep, avenging the 1995 loss. Then came the finals against the Seattle Supersonics. Seattle had won 64 games, the second best in the league. Gary Payton, the Defensive Player of the Year, Sean Kemp in his prime, Detlef Schrempf and coach George Karl's aggressive defense made them dangerous. The Sonics stole 2 games, forcing a Game 6. Chicago closed it out, winning their 4th championship. In 1997, the league was arguably at its deepest. Houston had formed a super team with Hakeem Olajuwon, Charles Barkley, and Clyde Drexler. This wasn't a paper tiger. Hakeem finished top 10 in MVP voting. Barkley was still averaging 20 and leading the league in rebounding. Drexler was an all-star, giving you 18, 6, and 6 as a third option. They swept Kevin Garnett's Timberwolves, beat the defending Western Conference champion Sonics in 7, and pushed Utah to the brink before John Stockton's buzzer beater in Game 6 sent the Jazz to the finals. Critics dismiss Houston as too old, but that's nonsense. Everyone was old. Jordan was 34, Pippen was 31, Rodman was 35, Stockton and Malone were in their mid-30s. That was the league, and those Rockets came within a shot of the finals. Instead, Chicago got Utah, and those Jazz were no joke. Karl Malone won the 1997 MVP, averaging 27 and 10. Stockton was still running the most efficient offense in basketball. Jeff Hornacek was an elite shooter. Byron Russell was a defensive pest, and Jerry Sloan had built a system around discipline and execution. Utah won 64 games in 1997, tied for the best record in the league. They beat the Lakers, beat the Rockets, and faced Chicago in the finals. The series was tied 2-2 before Jordan's legendary Game 5 flu game in Salt Lake City, where he dropped 38 points despite being visibly sick. The Bulls won in 6. In 1998, it all came to a head. The Jazz returned, winning 62 games. Malone was still an MVP candidate, Stockton was still steady, and Utah had home court advantage in the finals. Chicago's run to the finals included a grueling 7-game series against the Indiana Pacers. Reggie Miller, Rick Smits, Chris Mullin, Mark Jackson, Dale Davis, Antonio Davis, and coached by Larry Bird. The Pacers pushed Chicago to the limit, forcing a Game 7 in Chicago. The Bulls won, but it was their toughest series ever under Jordan. Then came the finals rematch with Utah. It went 6 games again, and it ended with Jordan's iconic shot over Byron Russell. A crossover, a pull-up, the final dagger of his Bulls career. That's 6 championships in 8 seasons against elite competition. The Showtime Lakers and Magic's last finals, Clyde Drexler's Blazers, Charles Barkley's MVP Suns, Gary Payton and Sean Kemp's 64-win Sonics, Karl Malone and John Stockton's back-to-back 60-win Jazz teams, Reggie Miller's Pacers pushing them to 7. Along the way, they knocked off the Knicks, the Cavs, the Heat, the Magic. That's not an easy road, that's a gauntlet. And that's just the direct competition. Indirectly, the Bulls also crushed other super team dreams. The Rockets, with Hakeem, Drexler, and Barkley, never made it to face them because Utah stopped them. The Lakers with Shaq, Eddie Jones, Nick Van Exel, and a young Kobe Bryant. The only Lakers team in history to send 4 players to the All-Star game in one season, were swept by Utah before they could meet Chicago. The Bulls didn't avoid super teams, they just watched their rivals eliminate them, then beat those rivals. Statistically, the 90s were as competitive as any era. The league expanded, but talent was spread across multiple franchises. The average win totals of Chicago's final opponents were higher than those faced by many modern dynasties. Defenses were stingier, the pace slower, possessions more valuable. You didn't get inflated numbers, you had to grind for everything. The New York Knicks, with Patrick Ewing's dominance inside and Pat Riley's bruising defense, built their entire identity trying to dethrone Chicago. The Orlando Magic rose and fell trying to surpass the Bulls, and when they failed, they lost Shaq to the Lakers. The Indiana Pacers pushed Chicago to the brink, only to be remembered as Jordan's final Eastern rival. The Utah Jazz had their best 2 seasons in franchise history, but they're remembered for coming up short twice against Jordan. Chicago didn't have an easy road. Chicago made the road look easy. That's the difference. So, the next time someone tries to tell you the Bulls had it easy, remember this. They beat dynasties. They beat future dynasties. They beat MVPs, Hall of Famers, and All-Stars across the board. They didn't just win, they changed the entire standard for what winning meant. The 1990s NBA wasn't weak, it was stacked. The Bulls weren't lucky, they were just that good. History doesn't lie, but fans do, and when you strip away the excuses, the myths, and the lazy narratives, all that's left is the truth. 6 championships, 2 three-peats, and a dynasty that didn't survive an easy league. It conquered a brutal one. What do you guys think? What's the biggest NBA lie you've ever heard repeated so many times people think it's true? Drop it in the comments. I'll be reading, and as always, thanks for watching HardWood MVP.